In the heart of England, nestled between lush green hills and dense woodlands, lay the small, sleepy town of Birmingham. Life here moved at a slow pace, where everyone knew each other by name, and days were filled with simple pleasures like sipping tea in cozy cottages or tending to gardens bursting with flowers. The townsfolk prided themselves on their peaceful existence, far removed from the chaos of big cities. But lately, whispers had begun to ripple through the community, disturbing the calm that everyone cherished. It all started when old Mr. Thompson, a farmer who lived near the edge of town, reported something strange. He claimed he'd seen shadowy figures moving around the ancient castle ruins late at night. At first, no one paid much attention. After all, the ruins had stood there for centuries, crumbling but harmless. Children often played among the moss-covered stones during the day, pretending to be knights and kings. But Mr. Thompson insisted these weren't kids. They're men, he said, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted the tale at the local pub. Tall men, dressed in red coats, marching like soldiers. The description sent shivers down spines. Red coats. That could only mean one thing: the King's Guards. These elite ceremonial troops were known for their striking uniforms and regal presence at royal events. But what would they be doing in a quiet place like Birmingham? No one could answer that question, and soon more reports began pouring in. Mrs. Harper swore she heard distant drums echoing across the fields at dawn. Young Tommy Jenkins claimed he saw flickering torchlights near the ruins while walking his dog after sunset. Even the usually unflappable baker, Mrs. Potts, admitted to feeling uneasy when she spotted unfamiliar carriages parked along the narrow road leading to the site. Inspector Harold Whittaker, the town's trusted police officer, was tasked with investigating these claims. A burly man with a booming voice and a no-nonsense attitude, Harold wasn't easily rattled. He'd spent years keeping order in Birmingham, dealing with everything from runaway sheep to petty thefts. Yet, this situation felt different. There was an air of mystery surrounding the ruins now, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. On a chilly morning, Harold drove his patrol car to the outskirts of town, parking near the overgrown path that led to the ruins. As he stepped out, the crisp autumn air nipped at his cheeks, and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. The ruins loomed ahead, their jagged walls cloaked in ivy. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. Harold walked slowly, scanning the ground for clues. Then something caught his eye, a gleaming object half buried in the dirt. Kneeling down, he picked it up. It was a badge-like insignia, polished and pristine, bearing intricate symbols associated with the monarchy. Harold frowned, turning the object over in his hands. This wasn't just some random trinket. It was official, expensive-looking, and clearly left behind intentionally. Before he could ponder further, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. Emerging from the mist were three figures, tall and imposing, clad in the unmistakable red coats of the King's Guards. Their expressions were stern, almost robotic, as if they'd been carved from stone. One of them stepped forward, introducing themselves curtly before refusing to answer any questions about their purpose there. When Harold pressed harder, demanding explanations, the guard simply turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone amidst the ruins, clutching the mysterious insignia and seething with frustration. The next morning, Inspector Harold Whittaker sat at his desk in the small police station, staring at the insignia he'd found near the ruins. The shiny emblem seemed to mock him, its intricate design hinting at secrets far beyond his usual line of work. He wasn't used to mysteries like this. His job typically involved breaking up pub brawls or finding lost cats, but something about the guard's presence gnawed at him. Who were they really? And why had they shown up in Birmingham without explanation? Determined to get answers, Harold decided to dig deeper. He started by visiting the town library, a cozy little building with creaky wooden floors and shelves, lined with dusty books. There, he met Margaret Henslow, a retired historian who spent most of her days surrounded by old manuscripts and faded maps. Margaret was known for her sharp mind and encyclopedic knowledge of local history, so Harold hoped she might shed some light on the situation. "King's Guards, you say?" Margaret asked, adjusting her glasses as she listened intently to Harold's story. She tapped her chin thoughtfully before disappearing into the stacks. Moments later, she returned with an armful of books and papers. "These uniforms, they're ceremonial, meant for parades and state functions. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to see patrolling ruins in the middle of nowhere." Harold nodded, leaning forward eagerly. "That's what I thought too. But they were definitely there, and they weren't happy to see me." Margaret flipped through one of the books, pointing to a passage about the King's Guards. According to the text, the unit dated back centuries, originally formed to protect the monarchy during times of war. Over time, their roles shifted to more symbolic duties, though rumors persisted about secretive operations tied to royal traditions. "It's possible," Margaret mused, "that they're here because of the ruins themselves. They might believe the site has historical significance, or even that it belongs to them." This idea troubled Harold. If the guards truly believed the ruins were theirs, it could spell trouble for the townspeople. The land had always been considered communal property, a place where families picnicked and children played. No one had ever questioned who owned it before. But if the guards decided to claim it, Harold knew it would cause outrage among the residents. As the days passed, reports of strange activity near the ruins continued to trickle in. One evening, Harold received a call from Mr. Thompson, the farmer who'd first spotted the guards. His voice trembled with urgency. "They're back," he whispered. "I saw them again, marching around like they owned the place. And this time, they've set up tents." Harold wasted no time grabbing his flashlight and heading out to investigate. By the time he arrived, night had fallen, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with tension as he approached the ruins. Sure enough, glowing lanterns illuminated the area, revealing not just a few guards, but an entire encampment. Tents had been erected around the crumbling walls, and men in red coats moved about with purpose, their boots crunching against the gravel. Harold stepped closer, his heart pounding. "What's going on here?" he called out, his deep voice cutting through the silence. The guards turned to face him, their expressions unreadable beneath their tall bearskin hats. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. Captain Alaric Pembroke. He introduced himself curtly. "We are conducting authorized exercises on this land." "Authorized by whom?" Harold shot back, narrowing his eyes. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." Pembroke raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Our orders come directly from the Crown," he replied smoothly. "You'll have to take it up with them." Harold bristled at the dismissal. He took a step closer, his towering frame looming over the captain. "Listen here," he growled, his voice rising. "I don't care if your orders came from the Queen herself. This is my town, and I won't let you march in and do whatever you please without answering to someone." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, neither willing to back down. The guards stood motionless, watching the exchange with stoic faces. Finally, Pembroke gave a slight nod. "Very well, Inspector," he said coolly. "We'll be in touch." With that, he signaled to his men, and they began packing up their equipment, retreating into the darkness. As Harold watched them leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was only the beginning. Whatever the guards were hiding, it was clear they weren't going to make things easy for him, or for Berringham. The following days were anything but ordinary for Inspector Harold Whittaker. The encounter with Captain Pembroke and his men had left him restless, his mind racing with questions. Who exactly were these guards, and what gave them the audacity to set up camp on land that didn't belong to them? More importantly, why did they act as though they were untouchable? Harold wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but this situation felt like stepping into uncharted territory. He needed answers, and fast. Determined to uncover the truth, Harold returned to Margaret Henslow, the retired historian who had already proven to be an invaluable ally. This time, he brought her the insignia he'd found at the ruins, hoping it might offer some clues. Margaret examined it closely, her eyes widening as she traced the engraved symbols with her fingers. "This is fascinating," she murmured, pulling out another dusty book from her collection. After flipping through its pages, she looked up at Harold with a mix of excitement and concern. "These markings, they are linked to an old royal decree. It's possible the guards believe the ruins hold historical significance tied to the monarchy." Harold frowned, leaning back in his chair. "But the townspeople have been using that land for generations. No one's ever mentioned any connection to the crown before." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's because the history isn't widely known. Most records about the ruins were lost over time. But if the guards are here, it means someone must have dug up those old documents or decided to reinterpret them." As the two discussed the implications, word of the guards' presence spread further throughout Birmingham. The once peaceful town was now buzzing with tension. Some residents sided with the guards, believing their arrival was a sign of honor, a nod to the town's supposed royal heritage. Others, however, saw them as intruders disrupting their way of life. Arguments broke out at the market, and even longtime friends found themselves divided. Meanwhile, Harold began noticing subtle changes in the behavior of his superiors. When he reported the latest developments to Chief Inspector Grayson, the response was lukewarm at best. "Be careful how you handle this, Whittaker," Grayson warned, his tone unusually cautious. "There are sensitivities involved. Higher-ups don't want unnecessary trouble." "What kind of sensitivities?" Harold pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. But Grayson only shook his head, refusing to elaborate. It was clear that political pressure was being applied from somewhere above. Pressure that made Harold's job infinitely harder. Feeling increasingly isolated, Harold turned to the townspeople for support. At a community meeting held in the village hall, he laid out everything he knew. The mysterious insignia, the guards' evasive answers, and the potential threat to their shared land. The room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and anger. "We can't let them take our land," shouted Mrs. Harper, clutching her knitting needles tightly. "It's ours." Others chimed in, sharing stories of family picnics and childhood adventures at the ruins. For many, the site wasn't just a piece of land. It was a cherished part of their identity. Inspired by their passion, Harold promised to fight for their rights, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. But as he left the meeting that night, Harold couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The guards weren't going to back down easily, and neither were the powers that seemed to be backing them. Still, Harold knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let fear or intimidation stop him. If the king's guards wanted a battle, they'd gotten one, with a man who roared louder than anyone expected. The tension in Birmingham reached a boiling point one chilly evening when Harold Whittaker decided to confront the guards once again. Armed with determination and the growing support of the townspeople, he marched toward the ruins under the cover of darkness. The air was thick with unease as he approached the crumbling walls, now surrounded by an organized encampment. Lanterns flickered softly, casting long shadows across the ground, and the faint sound of boots scuffing against gravel filled the silence. Harold's jaw tightened as he took in the scene before him. This wasn't just a temporary setup. It looked like the guards intended to stay for the long haul. Tents were neatly arranged, supplies stacked in orderly piles, and men patrolled the perimeter with precision. It was clear they had no intention of leaving quietly. As Harold stepped closer, his presence didn't go unnoticed. The days following Harold's explosive confrontation at the ruins marked a turning point in Birmingham. The townspeople, stirred by his bold stand, began to rally around him with newfound determination. What had started as whispers of unease had now transformed into a united front, with residents eager to protect their land and heritage. Margaret Henslow played a crucial role in this shift, using her knowledge of history to dig deeper into the origins of the ruins. She became Harold's unofficial strategist, poring over dusty archives and forgotten documents late into the night. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old papers stored in the town hall's basement, Margaret stumbled upon something extraordinary, a faded parchment bearing the seal of King Edward II. Her hands trembled as she carefully unfolded it, revealing elegant handwriting that outlined a royal decree from centuries past. According to the document, the land surrounding the ruins had been granted to the people of Berringham as a gesture of gratitude for their loyalty during a time of war. Though the decree was ancient, its implications were clear. The ruins belonged to the townsfolk, not the monarchy, or anyone else claiming ownership. "This changes everything," Margaret said breathlessly when she showed the document to Harold later that evening. They sat in her cozy study, surrounded by stacks of books and maps. Harold leaned forward, his eyes scanning the fragile paper. "If this is real, and I believe it is, it proves they have no right to be there." Harold wasted no time sharing the discovery with the townspeople. At another community meeting, he held up the parchment like a trophy, explaining its significance in simple terms everyone could understand. "This land isn't theirs, it's ours," he declared, his voice resonating with conviction. "And we're going to prove it." Inspired by the revelation, the townsfolk sprang into action. Some volunteered to help gather more evidence, scouring attics and libraries for additional records. Others spread the word beyond Berringham, reaching out to journalists and historians who might amplify their cause. Even Mr. Thompson, the farmer who had first reported the guard's presence, offered to keep watch over the ruins, ensuring no further disturbances went unnoticed. But Harold knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. To challenge the guards effectively, they needed legal backing, and that meant taking their case to higher authorities. With Margaret's guidance, Harold drafted a formal complaint outlining the situation, attaching copies of the royal decree and other supporting documents. He sent it to both local government offices and national oversight bodies responsible for managing royal properties. It was a risky move. Involving such powerful entities could either work in their favor or backfire spectacularly. But Harold didn't see any other option. As the weeks passed, anticipation hung heavy in the air. The guards remained stationed at the ruins, though their demeanor grew increasingly tense. Captain Pembroke, once so confident, now seemed on edge whenever Harold appeared. During one brief encounter, Harold noticed the captain glancing nervously at the growing number of townspeople gathering nearby, holding signs that read "Our land, our rights, and history belongs to everyone." Clearly, the tide was turning. Margaret, ever the voice of reason, reminded Harold to stay focused. "We've done all we can for now," she said one evening as they reviewed their progress. "The next step is out of our hands. All we can do is wait, and hope justice prevails." Harold nodded, though his mind raced with possibilities. He knew the fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. The people of Berringham had come together in ways he never imagined, proving that even the smallest voices could make a difference when united. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The roar that had begun with Harold was now echoing through every corner of the town, and perhaps soon, far beyond it. The formal complaint Harold filed quickly gained traction, sparking a chain reaction that neither he nor the townspeople had fully anticipated. Within days, news outlets picked up the story, turning Berringham into an unlikely focal point of national attention. Journalists flocked to the small town, eager to capture interviews with Harold, Margaret, and the residents who were standing their ground against the king's guards. Headlines like "Small Town Takes on Royal Might" and "Who Owns History" dominated newspapers and television segments, drawing both sympathy and skepticism from the public. As the media circus unfolded, pressure mounted on government officials to address the situation. A high-ranking representative from the Department of Royal Affairs, a stern-looking man named Sir Reginald Hawthorne, arrived in Berringham to assess the matter personally. His visit was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a sign that justice might finally prevail, while others feared he would side with the guards due to his close ties to the monarchy. Harold prepared meticulously for the meeting, knowing this was their best chance to present their case. Alongside Margaret, he compiled all the evidence they had gathered: the royal decree, historical records, photographs of the ruins, and testimonies from townspeople. They even included letters of support from historians across the country, many of whom agreed that the land rightfully belonged to Berringham. The meeting took place in the town hall, a modest building that seemed almost comical compared to the grandeur typically associated with royal matters. Sir Reginald sat at the head of the table, flanked by aides scribbling notes furiously. Across from him were Harold, Margaret, and a handful of trusted townsfolk, their faces etched with determination. Captain Pembroke and 2 of his men were also present, their expressions unreadable but noticeably tense. Harold opened the discussion, laying out their argument with calm precision. He explained the significance of the royal decree, emphasizing how it granted ownership of the land to the people centuries ago. "This isn't just about us," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about preserving history and ensuring that power doesn't override what's right." When it was Captain Pembroke's turn to speak, his tone was defensive. "Our presence here is rooted in tradition," he argued. "The Crown has every right to protect sites of historical importance, especially those tied to its legacy." Sir Reginald listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When both sides had presented their cases, he requested time to review the documents privately. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved, but Harold tried to remain optimistic. "We've done everything we can," he told Margaret afterward. "Now it's up to him." 2 days later, Sir Reginald called another meeting to deliver his verdict. This time, the room was packed, not only with locals but also reporters and curious onlookers. As Sir Reginald stood to address the crowd, the tension was palpable. Clearing his throat, he began, "After careful consideration of the evidence provided, I have concluded that the claims made by Inspector Whittaker and the people of Berringham are valid. The land surrounding the ruins was indeed granted to the community under royal decree, and no subsequent documentation overrides that agreement." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Harold felt a surge of relief, though he remained composed. Sir Reginald continued, "Furthermore, I must stress that the King's Guards acted without proper authorization in establishing their encampment. Effective immediately, they are ordered to withdraw from the site." Captain Pembroke's face turned ashen. For the first time since their encounters began, he looked genuinely shaken. Without uttering a word, he nodded curtly and left the room, followed by his men. Outside, the townspeople erupted into cheers, hugging one another and celebrating their hard-fought victory. But Harold knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Though the guards were leaving, the scars of the conflict would linger, for the town, for its people, and perhaps even for the monarchy itself. Still, as he stepped outside to join the jubilant crowd, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Together, they had proven that courage and unity could challenge even the most daunting adversaries. And sometimes, all it took was one loud roar to start a movement. The withdrawal of the King's Guards from the ruins marked a turning point for Berringham, but it wasn't the end of the story. In fact, the events that followed only deepened the town's resolve to protect its history, and ensured nothing like this could ever happen again. Margaret Henslow, who had been instrumental in uncovering the royal decree, continued her research with renewed vigor. She spent hours poring over additional documents, determined to piece together the full history of the ruins and their significance. One afternoon, while examining an old map stored in the archives of a nearby university, Margaret made another startling discovery. The ruins weren't just remnants of a forgotten castle. They were part of a larger network of medieval fortifications built to defend the region during times of conflict. Even more surprising was the revelation that these structures had been funded not by the monarchy, but by local communities pooling their resources. "This changes everything," Margaret exclaimed when she shared the news with Harold. "These ruins aren't just a symbol of royal power. They're a testament to what ordinary people can achieve when they work together." Harold immediately saw the potential. If the ruins held such historical value, then preserving them wasn't just about protecting land. It was about honoring the spirit of unity that had defined Birmingham centuries ago. Inspired by this idea, he proposed transforming the site into a protected heritage landmark. Not only would this safeguard the ruins from future disputes, but it could also attract visitors interested in learning about the town's rich past. The townspeople embraced the idea wholeheartedly. Fundraisers were organized, with everyone pitching in however they could. Mrs. Potts baked dozens of pies to sell at the market, while Mr. Thompson donated a portion of his farm's profits to the cause. Young Tommy Jenkins even set up a lemonade stand, proudly declaring, "Every penny counts." The campaign gained momentum quickly, drawing support from neighboring towns and even tourists who had heard about Birmingham's courageous stand against the King's Guards. Meanwhile, Captain Pembroke and his men quietly retreated to their barracks, humiliated by the outcome. Back in London, whispers of discontent spread among higher-ranking officials within the King's Guards. Questions arose about how such a blunder had occurred, how seasoned officers could have acted without verifying proper authorization. Though no official apology was issued, rumors suggested internal investigations were underway to determine accountability. As weeks turned into months, life in Birmingham began returning to normal, but with one major difference. The ruins, once overlooked, now stood as a source of immense pride for the community. With funds raised locally and supplemented by grants from historical preservation organizations, restoration efforts began. Crumbling walls were stabilized, overgrown vegetation cleared, and informational plaques installed to educate visitors about the site's storied past. Margaret published a book detailing her findings, which became a bestseller in local bookstores and further cemented Birmingham's place in history. For Harold, the experience had been transformative. He'd always seen himself as a simple officer tasked with keeping order in a quiet town. But through this ordeal, he realized he was capable of much more. His booming voice, once reserved for scolding troublemakers, had become a rallying cry for justice and unity. People often joked that his roar could wake the dead, but Harold took it as a compliment. After all, sometimes waking people up was exactly what was needed. On a crisp autumn morning, Harold stood at the edge of the restored ruins, watching his family stroll through the grounds. Children laughed as they climbed atop the ancient stones, pretending to be knights defending their kingdom. For a moment, Harold allowed himself to smile. The battle may have been fought against overwhelming odds, but it had brought the town closer than ever before. And though he never sought recognition, Harold knew one thing for certain. When the people of Birmingham looked back on this chapter of their lives, they wouldn't remember him as just an inspector. They'd remember him as the man who roared for what was right. The transformation of the ruins into a protected heritage site marked the beginning of a new chapter for Birmingham. What had once been a quiet, overlooked corner of the town was now alive with energy and purpose. Visitors from across the country began arriving to see the historic landmark that had sparked such a remarkable story. School groups came to learn about medieval history. Tourists marveled at the ancient stones, and historians praised the preservation efforts. The ruins weren't just a relic of the past. They were a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up for what is right. Harold Whittaker found himself at the center of this newfound attention, though he remained as humble as ever. Reporters often asked him how it felt to take on the King's Guards and win, but Harold always deflected the praise. "It wasn't me," he'd say with a modest shrug. "It was the people of Birmingham. They're the ones who made this happen." Still, there was no denying the impact of his leadership. His determination and courage had inspired an entire community to rise up and protect something they held dear. Even Margaret Henslow, who rarely missed an opportunity to tease him, admitted, "You might not have known it at the time, Harold, but you've got the heart of a lion." Margaret herself became something of a local celebrity. Her book, Echoes of the Past, the untold story of Birmingham's ruins, flew off shelves and earned her invitations to speak at historical conferences. She used the platform to advocate for preserving lesser-known historical sites, reminding audiences that history wasn't just about kings and queens. It was also about ordinary people whose stories deserved to be told. Through her work, she ensured that Berringham's legacy would endure for generations to come. As for Captain Pembroke and the King's Guards, their presence in the town faded into memory. Rumors circulated that the captain had been reassigned to a remote outpost, far from public scrutiny. Some whispered that the incident had tarnished the reputation of the unit, forcing them to reevaluate their practices. While Harold didn't revel in their downfall, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The guards' arrogance had underestimated the strength of a united community, and that was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Life in Berringham settled into a rhythm of quiet pride. The annual Harvest Festival, once a modest gathering, grew into a grand celebration honoring the town's history and spirit. Each year, a special ceremony was held at the ruins, where residents gathered to reflect on the events that had brought them closer together. Children performed plays reenacting Harold's confrontation with the guards, complete with dramatic roars that echoed through the valley. It became a cherished tradition, one that reminded everyone of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. On crisp autumn mornings, Harold often visited the ruins alone, finding solace in their weathered beauty. He liked to sit on a bench near the entrance, watching as sunlight filtered through the trees and danced across the stones. Sometimes, he'd strike up conversations with visitors curious about the site's history. Other times, he simply sat in silence, reflecting on how much had changed since that first foggy morning when he'd stumbled upon the mysterious insignia. One day, as he sat there lost in thought, a young boy approached him shyly. "Are you Inspector Whittaker?" the child asked, clutching a tattered copy of Margaret's book. When Harold nodded, the boy grinned. "My teacher said you're a hero. Is that true?" Harold chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not really," he replied gently. "I'm just someone who believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And you know what? So did everyone else in this town." The boy beamed, clearly satisfied with the answer, and ran off to join his friends exploring the ruins. Harold watched him go, a small smile playing on his lips. Heroes or not, the people of Berringham had proven that even the smallest voices could make a difference when they stood together. And sometimes, all it took was one loud roar to remind the world of that truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ancient stones, Harold rose from the bench and turned toward home. The battle may have ended, but its lessons lived on, in the hearts of the townspeople, in the stories passed down through generations, and in the enduring legacy of a little town that refused to back down.